All right, hey, awesome to be back again for another Avalanche Summit. I think my talk here last year was probably my favorite of the year. I think most of the reason why it was just a bunch of Q&A with the audience. I think we got into like some really interesting questions. So I'm going to try to go relatively quickly enough to get us some decent Q&A towards the end of it. So LayerZero, expand or die. The world is changing, and the rate at which people realize it I think still surprises me pretty consistently. So we hit a pretty interesting milestone recently where you have all of these native bridges from each of these individual ecosystems, right? So Avalanche has its own native bridge, Polygon, Arbitrum, Optimism. These typically have the subdomain, you know, your bridge.arbitrum.com, bridge.avalanche.com, whatever that may be, typically free to go into and out of the ecosystem. They sort of have all of the structural advantages. And we hit this milestone of LayerZero now starting to do as much or more messaging volume into each of these ecosystems as their own native bridge, which was like a very sort of pivotal moment of just proof of what we were doing, that this sort of like the fact that you would start to have more messaging flow into each of those. But the more interesting part of this is that this milestone is not now. This was actually 8 months ago. And this is what it looks like now. So, you know, you're talking 97 to 99.65% market share from each of these ecosystems. So somewhere between 50 to 200x volume that LayerZero does to each of these ecosystems. And that's not LayerZero as a whole. That is LayerZero to Arbitrum versus Arbitrum's native bridge. LayerZero to Optimism versus Optimism's native bridge, and so on, right? So when we were looking back sort of 8 months ago, and we were thinking at the time, the only structural disadvantage that any of these native bridges had was the fact that they were only pairwise, right? So you could go from Ethereum to Avalanche and Avalanche to Ethereum, but you couldn't go from Avalanche to Solana or to Arbitrum or vice versa. Same thing, ETH to Arbitrum, Arbitrum to ETH, but you couldn't go Arbitrum to Optimism. And so as we were looking at this, the original pathways that I actually thought would be the most used are, okay, somebody goes Ethereum to Arbitrum, great, they're going to use Arbitrum's native bridge, it's free, you go over there, but somebody might pay a premium and price risk to come back and not want to wait the 7-day period. And so I said, okay, great, you'll have these people who are sort of like bypassing the roll-up window, coming back to Ethereum, and that will be the most used pathway. That reality has not played out at all. So, you know, happy to say that I was completely wrong there. It's still like a pretty used pathway, much more frequently than the native bridges is. But actually, the more interesting thing is this layer of horizontal composability. So a lot of the L2s right now, the user base is basically treating them as more or less like homogeneous or fungible ecosystems. And so what they want is not to go from Arbitrum back to Ethereum. What they want is to go from Arbitrum to Optimism and Optimism to Arbitrum. They've already made the choice to go ETH upwards to L2s, and now they want to go sort of across at this horizontal layer. And so by far the most used messaging pathways, the single most is Arbitrum, but its most used pathway is Optimism and vice versa, right? So this choice of not being point-to-point and being like a pure mesh really has played a huge impact. And so the same thing, when you look at Avalanche, right, you're talking 99.65% versus 0.35%, right? So 200x, more than 200x more volume, and almost all of that is this sort of like Avalanche out to the external world and into Avalanche, which is very interesting and not at all, again, what we were originally expecting. And so that layer of horizontal composability, now when you go a layer above, you know, now we're talking layer 3s, we're talking subnets in the Avalanche ecosystem, and the desire and ability to have a fungibility of assets or like a homogeneous user experience across those is super important. I'll get back to it in a couple more slides, but just noting that for the moment. So, all right, Avalanche, value transferred to and from over LayerZero. Yeah, this was apparently old deck, so you weren't even supposed to see that one. It was supposed to be this one to really illustrate the sort of gap, right? So you're going from that original 150,000 to 4 million now, which is night and day difference, and you see it in the market share percentage. So Avalanche, 1.94 million messages to and from the Avalanche ecosystem in the last 13 months since we've launched, $2.6 billion of value transferred. And this is just to Avalanche C chain, not even accounting for any of the subnets, any of the extra ecosystems that are being built out. Now, again, going back to that layer of horizontal composability, one thing that we saw that was very interesting was this desire or need to have an asset that moves away from the traditional asset bridges. So if anybody heard me talk last year, heard me talk anytime throughout the last year, I talked a lot about this concept of LayerZero's OFT, which is the ability to say, if you're going to move assets, if you're going to move your single token, do you want to use a wrapped asset, some external bridging provider where you're losing control of the underlying token itself, you're giving up all abilities the token has, so if you have anything that's custom in it, you're basically getting minted some vanilla ERC20 on the other side, and then you're paying 6, 8, 10, 12 bips to some external bridging provider. With the OFT, you basically have the ability to go and take this into everything being owned in the contract. So all supply is just coordination between the contracts. And so now if you have USDC, if you have BTCB in Avalanche's case, if you have any of these, you can move, you're talking $100 million of Bitcoin you can move for literally the price of gas, right? So move $100 million from Solana to Avalanche, you're going to pay 11 cents or something, right? Which opens up a huge amount of possibilities when you're talking about now what does that do to markets when asset supplies are basically completely fungible. So no longer do you have to go to the Circle backend and say, okay, there's a small amount of parties who can redeem on one side and mint on the other side and move the supply over. Now it's open to any user being able to do that. And so if you can move near unlimited amounts of the native assets that are being traded between these ecosystems, now you're talking you can ARB asset pairs at like sub-cent spreads, which is super, super, super interesting in terms of like overall liquidity and just market efficiency between pairs across all chains. So OFT launched a year ago, had very little expectations early on. It really was a way, like Stargate was one of the first protocols that was launching where it's like, okay, we're launching on 7 chains and like we need to give the user some native experience across all 7 where you're not choosing a winner. There's not a single canonical chain for Stargate. There are 7 chains, all of them are local and canonical, all of them are minted by Stargate, and the contracts just control the supply. So after that, you have Gurley ETH, BTCB, Joe from Trader Joe, Cake from PancakeSwap, Angle, Radiant, all of these have adopted the OFT standard, and you see the growth of OFT messaging volume just like straight up and to the right. So it's been very, very interesting to watch, and I think very compelling for the ecosystems who have adopted it. And so when you go here, like, what does that actually mean to anybody who has sort of adopted these things? So Stargate, 13 months in, is about to cross $10 billion in value transferred in the first year, which is crazy, especially when you're talking about in terms of capital efficiency these days. It sits at about $450 million of standing capital. Emissions have been slashed by something like 90 to 95% over the past year. And yet still, I think it's did $2.6 billion almost in transactional volume this month alone. So we'll cross 10 billion soon. PancakeSwap, right? What is the story of going? Like, what does this actually buy you? Why should you care about the title expand or die? All of these are instances of why that actually matters and will matter more and more moving forward. So PancakeSwap moved to 2 different ecosystems. You see TVL growth on both of these chains, just like purely up and to the right, fee growth, market share growth in all of these. DeFi kingdoms, stranded on Harmony prior, right? Harmony bridge hack happens. They're going to move. They make their own subnet. They come to their subnet. Now they're doing 1.5 million messages, transactions per day in their subnet. More gas usage than Ethereum, I think, on most days, just because of the like expressiveness of the contracts and kind of the complexity of things that they can do by having their own subnet. 300,000 messages moving to or from, and now trivially easily they go from that first step of okay, Harmony to subnet, subnet to Harmony. Now they go to Clayton, entirely new user base, still have the ability to like expand what they're doing to these different ecosystems. BTCB. Avalanche's Bitcoin, for anybody who knows, is sort of connection to go directly from Bitcoin in a completely permissionless manner and go Bitcoin to BTCB on Avalanche or BTCB on Avalanche to Bitcoin. But it's just one way, Bitcoin to Avalanche, Avalanche and back, just like the Avalanche bridge between Ethereum. BTC adopts the OFT standard to go to other ecosystems, immediate 77% growth in the overall issuance of BTCB. So again, immediate change in the underlying of just adoption across the ecosystem and how useful it becomes to people. Now it becomes an asset that is leveraged within Ethereum dexes, within Arbitrum dexes, within all of these other places, and that drives growth, which I think is what most applications care about more than anything. Gurley Bridge. I don't know if anybody caught my talk, my debate, I guess, in Denver, but like Gurley ETH and Gurley Bridge was like a very hot topic for a little bit on whether or not this is something that A, would be accretive at all to the ecosystem, or B, useful. Gurley Bridge is probably 3 months old now, has done 650,000 messages, and has had 180 million Gurley ETH put in the hands of developers through swaps, right? So like very, very, very compelling. The number of people who have come and said like how impossible it was to get Gurley ETH or test at all in that ecosystem prior versus now is night and day. And so even something small as making this like simple permissionless structure that allows access in the ecosystem, massive, massive, massive shift in the overall sort of access to the ecosystem, but also just like metrics around like what is being done in contract deploys. And then little pudgies I threw in as a as just an example on the NFT side, because most of this, you were talking about value transfer. Pudgies, I think, one of the more interesting, one of the more compelling things that Luca said to me after he did this. So they were on Ethereum for a very long time, went to 3 other chains. It went to Arbitrum, went to Arbitrum, Polygon, and BSC. And basically, so had found some traction on Ethereum. You know, one of the probably most notable or visible, certainly if you're on Twitter, NFT PFPs kind of in the space, went to these 3 other chains and basically immediately overnight became top 3 NFT on all 3 of those chains, right? So when you're talking about like an NFT and what it actually represents, it really just is like a social graph on steroids, right? Like their goal is just like touch as many people as humanly possible, and Luca talks about it through this funnel where you touch people through whether it's GIFs or memes and seeing other people in conversations and Twitter PFPs, and then ultimately end up at like these 8,888 people who may actually own the asset. But expanding that social graph matters, and the ability to do it easily adds huge, huge, huge leverage to the underlying project. And so messaging on LayerZero, pretty crazy, feels kind of surreal at the moment now. It took us 7.5 months to do our first 1 million messages, 2.5 months to do our next 1 million after that. We're gonna cross 10 million on Friday at this pace. So really, really insane to see. Stargate, again, gonna cross $10 billion in overall volume soon. The metric I care about more than anything, or that I pay attention to in the ecosystem more than anything, really is developer growth and what that actually means or looks like. Mainnet contracts is now close to 5,500. I think this is outdated by a couple of days. I think we did just cross 5,500. So 5,500 contracts deployed on mainnet. When you talk about a developer ecosystem, or you look across sort of the landscape of existing ecosystems, like 5,500 is a lot of contracts to have applications like meaningfully shipped and in production live. And the thing I look at even more than that is testnet contracts, and what does it look like? How many people are building on testnet? How many people make that conversion from testnet to mainnet, and what does this backlog look like of developers who have come in, touched the ecosystem, started to build something, and then going to transition? And so testnet, we're about to cross 30,000 contracts, which again has just been wild, and like this really, really steady growth of people coming in and building. The number of people who are shipping really completed projects that are 6+ months in the work onto mainnet over the next few months is crazy. So that has been mind-blowing. So overall, if you are not thinking about it, you should be thinking about it. If you are already thinking about it, definitely come and talk to us. Reach out to me, reach out to the team. I think the core thesis of expand or die is going to play out much, much more over the next coming year. And I think if you look into any of the metrics around what this is actually levers on what it has done for applications who have adopted, and just what market share has done for anybody who's expanded, there's an extremely, extremely, extremely compelling case. So that gives me 14 minutes for Q&A, which is good. I went even faster than I was hoping for. I was hoping for 10. So I hope we can repeat last year. And if anybody has questions, I want to just like dive into Q&A in genuine questions. So yeah, who's got something? Oh. Yeah. So we'll go back here. This is comparing native bridges here, right? So we are. Yeah. So to put in perspective, this month we did roughly 5 to 6 million messages. We're doing about 250, 280,000 messages a day. If you look at actual real applications and messages being sent, the next largest protocol is probably like single-digit thousand messages per day, and the next after that is probably like single-digit hundreds messages per day. So you're talking an order of 250 to 1,000x larger than the next most used messaging protocol. I tweeted out a picture the other day of just Stargate's numbers, not even all of LayerZero, and Stargate's only about 50% market share of LayerZero. I think the number was the next most used bridge in terms of frequency after Stargate was 9,800 transactions per 24 hours, and Stargate was 414,000. So the delta is pretty large. All right, I have a hard time seeing anybody who has hands up, so yeah. Sure. Stargate V2. Okay. Stargate deploys. We had really like no expectations around Stargate. We want a reference implementation on top of LayerZero. LayerZero launches March 15th last year. Stargate launches March 17th. We were thinking, tens of millions of dollars, maybe. 2 weeks later, there's $4.4 billion in the contracts. And this is like, this is not a fork of MasterChef where it's like been hardened and tested a million times. Like every single line of LayerZero was written from scratch. Every single line of Stargate was written from scratch. So 2 completely new protocols, like $4.4 billion in the contracts. Terrifying early on, spent a huge amount of time on security. This actually birthed pre-crime and a bunch of our other sort of security measures that stems from that. But it reinforced the original thesis around Stargate that wrapped assets generally suck, and they change the relationship that users have from this one of, when you use Uniswap, you use the protocol, and then you never think about it again, right? You inherit some risk on like, as I'm swapping, Uniswap code is bad, and I can get rugged. But once I'm done, I like never think about Uniswap again. I go on about my day, I own my asset. As soon as you move to wrapped assets, you have this IOU that the user carries, and the user now carries that risk in perpetuity. If the destination contracts ever has an issue, IOU is worth nothing. Source contract has an issue, IOU is worth nothing. So the whole thesis of Stargate was native pools, the LPs get to price the risk. They take the risk, they price the risk, but the user uses a protocol exactly like you would use Uniswap, right? User adds on one side, subtracts on the other. They inherit risk for the duration of the swap, and then they never think about it again. Fully native assets on both sides. So fast forward 13 months and $10 billion of transfer volume later, have learned a lot of things. Primarily, the way that Stargate did its pathways in Delta made price sensitivity matter a lot. So like the things that are coming in Stargate V2 are a couple of different fold. For the core Stargate V2 is going to be that everything will be roughly like 70% more gas efficient, 70 to 80% more gas efficient. So that's like, whatever, that's table stakes. Multi-hop routing will be introduced, which I think is the most interesting thing, because what we realized is you might have a pathway like Avalanche to Ethereum that gets imbalanced or drains. There's this EQ fee that kicks in on the sides. And you might have a very clear pathway of like Avalanche to BSC to Ethereum, or to Arbitrum to Ethereum, like whatever other pathway that is totally full with no EQ fee, but you can't do it because you're paying 6 bips both hops. So the ability to basically merge an unlimited amount of hops with only one single static fee, and then Hydra in terms of like how that expands and taps in. So I think what you will see from V2 is roughly 80 to 90% again reduction in emissions, 70-ish plus % gas efficiency and multi-op routing. So whatever Stargate does now, it's going to do tremendously better with basically near zero emissions. So I think there's a real chance Stargate ends profitable next year if both of those things go as expected. So yeah.
Given we are at Avalanche and Subnet is one of the key things. So for the enterprises who are looking to adopt Subnet, and
Yeah, 100%. So I think, we spend a lot of conversations these days, from central banks to, all of the TradFi institutions, right? This conversation we have all the time. So most that I've seen are starting simple, right? I think about it like you think about dark pools and HFT. Everybody wants to own their own, some way, real world assets, whatever it is. There's going to be some trading activity that happens. They want to own their slice of that. So they're going to on-chain some amount of trading activity or assets into their ecosystem, and everybody's starting there. And then the next step they want is, okay, great, JP Morgan has their own chain, Goldman has their own chain, they both have assets, and they both own sort of their own dark pool structure, but you need order flow to go between them because you need to open up the overall pool, right? So now you're connecting permission chains to permission chain. No problem, we do that. So already there, and then the next step after that everybody's trying to figure out is how do you go from permission chain to permissionless chain, right? And so again, all through, when we built LayerZero, the only thing that we had in mind, and the way that we think about the protocol in general, is if you think about a packet on the internet, it's literally just two computers, right? It's compute, some bytes array, and compute, and that's it. It's a very dumb, simple primitive to move bytes. And from this simple primitive on the internet, this packet, you have everything amazing that you have today. You're playing Fortnite and streaming Netflix, and all of this comes from that one base primitive. LayerZero is literally arbitrary contract invocation with a bytes array. Anything that you can do in a smart contract, you can do over LayerZero. The only thing that we care about is building that primitive that extends to everything. And so when you talk about what this looks like in the future, any of those chains can connect with any set of rules and conditions to any other ecosystem. And so the things that make LayerZero special, security of it, pre-crime added to it, and gas abstraction, right? It's the ability to make it so the consumer experience is, hey, you're going from Subnet A to Ethereum. Your user doesn't need to already have ETH in their wallet. They don't need to already have Matic in their wallet. You have the ability to build a user experience and a consumer experience that the user has no clue what the underlying chain is. They have no clue what the underlying gas asset is. They sign one transaction, whole flow gets executed. They can access anything through virtual accounts, basically, and all of that's tied to one single thing. So it's about building the developer experience that enables that. And that's how we think about the world. Yeah. Okay, I had a little bit of trouble here, but you're talking about the validator stuff, the network, right? Okay, validators, not applications. So validator set from day one, there's 3 things that we care about when we build, and it's basically, one is that it has to be entirely permissionless. So day one permissionless, anybody can run an Oracle, anybody can run a relayer, anybody can participate in validation. 2, if we disappeared, we're building a protocol, not a service, so if we disappeared from the face of the earth, if our office exploded, we're all gone, nothing should ever happen to LayerZero. The protocol will persist until the end of time, or Ethereum makes breaking changes effectively. So anybody can come in and run that. No application is beholden on us. We don't run a service for anybody. And the third is that if our only goal in life was to be malicious and to try to exploit an application, every application has the ability to protect against that. There is nothing that I can do to harm an application that does not expose themselves basically to defaults or whatever else. There is absolutely zero surface of risk that an application who wants to own their own security takes externally. And so right now, today, one of the big things we just announced was, I am thinking, I'm forgetting the word of gas for friends, Essence. Basically was a new thing that we introduced. And so today we have Chainlinks runs Oracle. There's this TSS Oracle that runs. There's a wait list of about 40 to 50 other validators who want to come on. We run a relayer at the moment. The hard part about running a relayer at the moment is this, is that every relayer, because you provide gas abstraction, needs to basically manage wallets on 35 mainnets and 45 testnets, balance those, keep them sort of topped up so that none of them are ever running, and that is unbelievably onerous to expect from somebody who's used to I want to run an ETH validator, I spin up an AWS node and I walk away. I don't, you just open up a Docker image. And so the whole point of Essence is basically taking that structure where now moving forward in the V2 release, you're going to be able to run a validator in under an hour, basically, to spin it up. You won't have to deal with any of the gas abstraction. You won't have to deal with anything. And so that's a huge, huge step forward. My guess is 6 months from now, there will be at least 50, if not 100-ish, of like the largest institutions validating on the network, and that's sort of like what the wait list we have now. So you can think all your sort of traditional node infra providers, block daemons, alchemies of the world, gelatos of the world, those sort of groups, and then projects themselves that want to run. So if you followed the Uniswap forum drama, we've talked about the Uniswap governance running their own, lots of things like this. So yeah. Yep.
Now they can do it practically like zero fee because your hop is so small, like zero hops. So like you guys do that?
Yeah, so we've not built an aggregator ourselves, but every major aggregator utilizes us, right? So they basically all use Stargate in their route. So a bunch of the Stargate volume comes from that. So these are your Li-Fi, so all of these sort of groups of the world who do this. So yeah, I mean, heavily used in aggregators currently. Yeah.
And this is both DEX and SEX, just like
So not SEX right now, right? There are stuff you can do. So a lot of centralized exchanges have issues listing assets because of the ability to manage inventory in the back end, and we make it incredibly, incredibly easy for them to manage that inventory. So when you talk about OFTs, when you talk about anything, right? If you deposit Stargate from any chain, they can easily swap it to any other chain. So they can facilitate deposits across the board. There's a reason why centralized exchanges like don't let you deposit from Arbitrum and withdraw to Ethereum, right? It's this imbalance problem. So they have inventory issues. It makes listing assets very hard for most of them. We help and work with them on that, but not direct integrations for anything else on SEX side. Yeah. All right, I think we have time for one more, if anybody has one. Just making sure I can actually see. Yeah, go ahead.
What are the next steps for LayerZero? Next year, next 5 years?
LayerZero, so again, by far, like, try to stay unopinionated. I always joke that like I was minting Gen Zero crypto kitties and like didn't see the NFT boom. I was farming yams at 300 million% and like didn't see DeFi summer. Like I don't believe in my ability to predict what's coming next. Our goal is simply to create the base primitive that's usable everywhere and scale that. And so one thing we had to deal with over the last couple months has been pure scaling, right? We were literally doing more volume to the layer 2s than layer 2s could ingest in a sequential order, which was crazy. So like we were giving them more transactions per minute than they could basically egress in time. So we had this backlog of like 80,000 transactions on Optimism alone, all because we do sequential order, right? Non-sorter enforcement. And so the ability of just like scaling a system, having a system that will actually function universally when you're talking about hundreds of millions of messages, like that is the goal on top of tooling. Then you see like LayerZero scan, I think is by far the most useful thing we've shipped in production in the ecosystem. And it is used by every single user in every single application on the network. So our goal is to build things that are accretive to the overall ecosystem, and then basically highlight all the people who are building on top of that. And so again, I think whether it's your world of DEXs, now it's PancakeSwap, Trader Joe, SushiSwap, now Uniswap through the network governance vote, all built on top of LayerZero, all utilizing in some way. I think you will continue to see that reach stretch, and our goal is just like allow them to make something that makes their product meaningfully better. So that's where we position ourselves. All right, that's it. My time's up. Thank you all.